When I pulled this bottle out, I didn't have high expectations for a really interesting story, but I really love it when I'm wrong. So let's get started on this episode of Antique Bottle Stories. I have to admit that on my last video, it was the first time that I had heard a guy named Gail. It turns out that this story is also about a guy named Gail Borden Jr. He was born in 1801 in upstate New York. His family moved around a lot when he was young. He lived in Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Texas. His mom died of yellow fever when he was in his 20s. He married Penelope, and they had 6 kids. The first baby died when she was 3. 1844 was an emotional year. His last son was born, and then that same year, his wife and one of his babies died during a yellow fever epidemic. So he's 43, newly widowed, with 4 kids, one of them being a brand new baby. The oldest was about 12 by then, so he could help out. And then he may have gotten married a second time to an unknown lady, because a couple sources say in 1860 he married Emmeline and she was his 3rd wife. So let's talk about his work. Now, he was a guy who was always inventing things and tinkering. Like a lot of inventors, there were a ton of ideas swirling around in his head, but the majority of products that he made were failures. But that didn't stop the ideas from swirling around. In fact, on his headstone it reads, "I tried and failed. I tried again and again and succeeded." So basically, he didn't get down about his failures, he just went on to the next idea. He was described as an eccentric dreamer and a tenacious fighter. Some of his many occupations included a school teacher, and him and his brothers worked as newspaper editors for a while, and he was a real estate salesman, and he was in the Texan Army. It turned out that he was really good friends with Sam Houston, who was an American general who led the Texas Revolution, which gained Texas from Mexico, and eventually joined Texas to the United States. Houston was the president of the Republic of Texas for some time, and obviously Houston, Texas is named for him. He appointed Borden as Texas Customs Collector. Borden was also really good friends with Stephen Austin, who Austin, Texas is named for, and his nickname is also the Father of Texas, and Borden became a chief surveyor under him. In fact, in 1836, Borden helped plot out the towns of Houston and Galveston, Texas. See, his name is right here. And he collaborated on the first topographical map of Texas. Borden was such good friends with Stephen Austin that he actually named one of his sons Stephen Austin Borden. Unfortunately, that's the son that died alongside Borden's wife during yellow fever when he was 5. Some of Borden's inventions were just absolutely absurd, and unfortunately I don't have any photos of any of these. One of these was called the Terrace Wagon, which was just a wagon/boat type of thing. It had wheels and a rudder and sails, and it was supposed to be an amphibious vehicle for land and sea. He tried it out in Texas, and he had a few volunteers try it, in which they promptly regretted their decision since they almost drowned. Since some of his family died from yellow fever, he started to focus on that for a little while, and he had concluded that it must be the hot weather that spreads yellow fever. So he concocted a giant refrigerated building that he tried to get Texans to live in there during the summer months, but nobody was really going for that. So he decided to use the refrigerated building for his next idea, a dehydrated meat biscuit, sort of like the Native American pemmican. This was during the gold rush, so he sold some of these to the gold rushers during their travel. A guy named Elisha Kane bought a bunch of his biscuits for his expedition to the Arctic. Now, this invention did earn Borden a gold medal in the London Crystal Palace Exposition of 1851. On his way back from London on the ship, apparently 4 children died on board because they drank milk from some sickly cows that were on board. The story goes that their deaths actually really affected him, and he knew that this was a known problem during this time, and so he turned his attention to milk. His mind started swirling ideas to make milk safer, Well, the first thing that he thought of from his experience with the beef biscuits is that when food is dehydrated, it lasts longer. So he tried to figure out a way to dehydrate milk. He tried boiling the water out of it, but by the time it got to that point, it either curdled or it was burnt. So back in New York, he visited some Quakers who gave him some ideas for taking the water out of milk. And later, he patented a vacuum condensation process in 1956. This process removed 75% of the water in milk at a much lower temperature, and he added some sugar as a preservative. So basically, he came up with sweetened condensed milk. By 1858, he was selling his milk under the Eagle brand, and the company was renamed New York Condensed Milk Company. Apparently, this condensed milk started in cans, but I did find some early condensed milk bottles online. Here's a look at the New York factory. Here's the engine room and the pan room, the tin shop and the sealing room, the ice house and the boiling room. Him and his business partner, Jeremiah Milbank, were doing pretty well, and during the Civil War, they got their big break when the U.S. Army ordered condensed milk for the troops, to which Borden struggled to keep up with the demand. He had to open up 2 additional factories. He ended up going around educating as many farmers as he could on good dairy farming techniques that he learned, such as treating the cows well as strict sanitation that he felt was required for uncontaminated milk, like washing the cow's udders before milking, and keeping the cow's living area clean and swept, and sanitize any containers used for keeping the milk. These sources say that Borden's practices were standards that we still use today. Now, I remember a milk story that we did a few videos back, very similar to Borden's story, where he came up with more sanitary ways to keep milk safe. I'm not sure which one of these inventors were first, but let's just be glad that there were people like this seeing a problem and they kept trying to find a solution for that problem. At some point, by 1866, Borden opened up a meat extract factory in Elgin, Illinois. This one seemed to be more about the juice and less about the actual meat. Borden took this idea of condensing, and he started condensing fruit juices and making jellies, and even coming up with an instant coffee. Now, he lived in Texas a good part of his life, and during his lifetime, he did a lot to give back to the community. He organized schools for blacks, he built several churches, and one source says that he encouraged employees to go to church on Sundays, and he would often pay them during church service hours. I don't know why he wouldn't just close shop on Sundays if it was that important to him. He was known to give employees extra money for vacations if he knew about it. And here's an article in 1868 that Gail Borden purchased 100 copies of the Constitution. He distributed them to teachers. He felt it important that the Constitution be studied in schools. Boy, do we need more guys like him today. So he died in Texas in 1874, and his body was shipped back to New York to be buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. There is a really beautiful write-up about him in the paper, and it just describes him as quirky but humble, a people person, truly caring about the people around him. It said even though he was wealthy, he was very generous, and it says he never put on an aristocratic air. He would sometimes be at work at 4 a.m. and work the whole day. In his will, it mentioned his companies as the New York Condensed Milk Company, which was in New York, the Borden Condensed Milk Company, and I'm not exactly sure where that factory was. Then we have the Illinois Condensing Company. That's the meat juices, and that's in Elgin, Illinois. Then we have the Borden Meat Preserving Company, and that's his meat biscuit company, and that's in Texas. He also mentions his business partner, Jeremiah Milbank, as, quote, my highly esteemed friend. And he continues to describe their partnership as, quote, a spirit of harmony and mutual confidence which ought to exist among members of a co-partnership, and it is my earnest desire that the same should continue after my decease. My representative should cooperate with Mr. Milbank in the carrying out the same general policy that has been pursued by him and myself. He ends up splitting his stocks up evenly between his wife and kids. He wrote his entire will, and this is his signature at the bottom. Now, Mr. Jeremiah Milbank died 10 years later in 1884, worth an estimated $8 million. In 1892, Samuel and Alfred Church, they are Borden's stepsons, they be Emmeline's sons. They lived in Elgin, Illinois, and they purchased and donated the Schofield Mansion on Spring Street to house a new library for the residents of Elgin. Samuel and Alfred's only request was that the library be called Gail Borden Public Library. Oh, that's nice. And this is what it looks like today. There is a Borden County in Texas. It was not a place where Borden lived, though, but it was named for him after his death, and its county seat is none other than a town named Gail. The New York Condensed Milk Company changed its name to Borden around 1899 to honor Borden. I'm not sure of all the events of all the locations, but we know that Borden's milk is still in stores today. So I tried to find a few bottle examples online for dating purposes, and I did find one here for 1910, and here's a 1928 example. And I didn't see any other examples until 1956, which they're in cartons by then. And I didn't see an example of mine in the papers, so I don't know exactly what the date is, but it is blown, so I would say it's pre-1920s. And that's all I've got for today. I really enjoyed learning about Mr. Borden and all his contributions to this world. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.